Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I will be showing you how to paint Squeeze the Day. I wanted to try something a little different, and I used some techniques that are surprisingly simple but create impressive results. So grab your brushes and be prepared to be amazed. Sealing the surface with a multi-purpose sealer is optional, however it provides a smoother surface and ensures better coverage. I'm using the 3/4 inch oval wash to base coat the surface with sand gray. I usually do a couple coats. This will give a nice opaque coverage, allowing it to dry in between. I'm loading a damp texture brush with Portobello and starting past the outer left edge and pulling it across. I'll repeat from the right side over. This will eliminate stop and start lines in the middle. Wanted to divide this up into 3 planks, and I'm using my T-square to mark that off. And then also I have trouble with straight lines, so I use the T-square always to bump against the side to make sure that that line is going to be perfectly straight. Little details like that are really important when adding horizontal lines that if they're off just a little bit, it's going to really show up. Again, I'm using my T-square, and I've loaded my Epic script liner with raw umber. Just going to line that center crack. I didn't go right against the edge of the T-square, but I went far enough away that I knew that it was going to be a straight line. I thought this was a little bit dark, so I grabbed some Snow White, and I'm adding more striations with that texture brush. Again, the brush is just damp, not wet, and the paint is a little bit thin. It's going to give smoother lines. The drier the paint, the thinner, the scratchier the lines are. I like that brighter background much, much better. And I'm just going to add it until I think it's bright enough, but because I did brighten it up quite a bit, I'm going back and deepening the shading along each side of those divisions with a little bit of thin raw umber. Very, very thin. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. Wanted to make sure this wasn't too overpowering. When I did this project, I wanted it to be more soft, like almost a watercolor effect. Always like to try something different, a new technique that will put a refreshing spin on using acrylics in the same way. Using my awesome angle and plenty of water. Wanted to make sure that it's nice and smooth and very translucent. That way, my awesome angles are a little bit longer in length. If you haven't tried them yet, they're really a nice brush. Gives a longer stroke, less reloading, and also it's going to have more continuity. Now I loaded my Radical Round. This is a number 5 with raw umber, and I'm holding it between my thumb and forefinger and just kind of rolling it around the edge. About a 45-degree angle. The bristles are pointing outward, and the paint is very, very thin, so I'm not getting a real solid, heavy coverage. The brush is at about a 45-degree angle. The sharper the angle, or I should say the angle, will determine the width of the chipping. Just provides a really nice kind of a border edging around a piece without being too overwhelming. And you can see how loose and soft or thin my paint is. And the bristles have to be pointed out, or it's not going to work correctly. What's nice about this, the color is just about identical to the side edges. I traced the lemons only onto the surface, and I had to count to make sure I had exactly seven lemons. Base coating it with salted caramel. It's pretty much just an oval shape with a flat top and a rounded pointed bottom on it. So I just want to make sure the paint's not real heavy, but I wanted to make sure that my strokes were nice and even. Painted the oval first and then went back and added the top and the bottom sections. And I pull the paint in long strokes down the entire lemon to make sure that that is going to be consistent. I don't want any brush strokes showing that are going to be messy. This is a new color by Decor. Absolutely love it. Salted caramel, very rich and opaque. When I do the doubled lemons, I have to decide which lemon is going to be in front of the other one. The first that I did, I changed my mind later and I moved the top lemon to the back, if that makes sense. This technique that I'm using is a little bit different for this project today. I wanted to try something that was not normal decorative painting, toll painting with the smooth, even strokes and shading and highlighting. I think this is kind of a fun vacation from stressful painting, using cadmium yellow to highlight. And these are the lemons. After I highlighted the top one, I decided it should be behind the bottom one. And I'll go back and switch that around later. And the paint is very loose, I have a lot of water in it, which makes it very workable for a long period of time. And I have to decide my light source is pretty much, usually it comes from the left, but because this is a wreath, it's more from the top left, if that kind of works. That way all of the lemons are going to be highlighted so that they're balanced out instead of everything from the left or the right. You can see I'm not floating that highlight in real smooth and even, just kind of, I would call this blocking it in, just to get that look of where the light source is coming from. I've loaded my Epic Script liner with raw umber, and I'm just lining those stems in. Very thin paint. That way if I decide I want to go back and change them, it's wet enough, long enough that I can really move it around quite easily. Just getting the look, the roundness of the wreath. Now I've loaded my number 5 radical round with lush green. This is thinned down also, and I'm sure you can see the divisions in the background planks kind of showing through. What's nice about using very wet paint is that it can be easily removed if it's not the way you prefer. Letting the brush create the shape of the leaves, kind of smashing it down and lifting it up and letting it pull out. They're not smooth, they're not even, they're a little bit raggedy on the edges. I love that look. And it's just letting the brush kind of wiggle and pull to create that shape. This is my number 5 radical round. I created this brush with a fat belly and a sharp point, and it's just perfect for this type of painting. And you can see it's just base coating that leaf, and I use the word base coat very loosely because it's not a solid coverage. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. This, I would say, is basically just for placement, to drop those leaves in so I know where everything else is going to be added. Some are lighter, some are darker, and that's okay. It can be, sometimes that randomness really works well. Baby duck, and I'm still using my 1/2 inch angle to shade with. By using a bigger brush, this is going to encourage me to not be so fussy. And I'm just laying that paint in there. You can see there is texture. You can see the brush strokes, but they're not choppy or messy. So I'm cleaning that outer edge up and then just kind of letting that right side just float out and not be perfectly smooth and even. And this is where I can really start to hone in on where I want the light to bounce back. Kind of being a little bit careful with some of these because I know I'm going to be putting more flowers in, and I'm going to want those areas shaded just a little bit more. Even still, with just a couple layers of highlights on, the paint is very thin. This is celery shoot. Again, I'm using my 1/2 inch angle. leaning on the toe to kind of mimic an angle or a liner brush for the center veins, and letting there it goes, just a little on the toe really pulls that center vein out, using the width of the brush to float and the center or the tip to add those finer lines. Still, it's not super precise. I'm just going mostly for highlight effect and letting the brush create that look. And I found out by doing this, the leaves are not smooth and flat and even. I really like the way that looks. Now I'm going back with plantation pine to add some shading in there. And this is where I start to really kind of clean up the other edges. We did on the top side, the highlight side, with a little bit of celery shoot to sharpen those edges. And now I'm adding the plantation pine on the back side. And keep in mind, there's many, many layers to come. So being precise at this point, just looking for adding that darkness and that contrast to build those leaves. I think at this point it's looking pretty good, but there's still many layers to go. Even so, and I found out working on all of the leaves at one time as opposed to creating one leaf and then going on to the next leaf, I think there's much more continuity. It's easier to build them all up together and have a really nice, balanced overall composition. A little bit of salted caramel to kind of enhance those shaded areas. I do take time between each application to look for balance. Using my number 5 radical round to add in the flowers, and these are not perfectly balanced, they're not even, the length of the petals on each one are different. I'm letting the brush create the shape of the flower. It's just a press and pull. My paint is very loose, and you can see I could just reach down and erase it with my finger because it's so thinned. And I'm just adding them in here and there to balance out fill in the empty areas. And I can allow it to go over the leaves, allow it to go over the lemons. It just makes it, kind of sweetens it up and brightens it up. And it's kind of funny, before I added the flowers in, the lemons look nice and bright, but now that the flowers are added in, they look just a little bit dingy. Adding a drop shadow, sticking with my number 5 radical round. This is my number 5 radical round and my 1/2 inch angle are my go-to brushes. I'm adding a drop shadow below and to the right of everything. Also, I'm going in and filling in behind the petals so that it doesn't look like it's empty back in there. So there's shadowing in the darker areas. This is very thin, very translucent. Shadows are not solid or heavy, and it's just a quick mimic of the shapes that I'm adding in the shadowing for. What a big difference a little bit of paint makes. If it's too bright, you can very easily go in with a damp paper towel to remove the darkness or the heaviness if it's in the wrong place. I did a couple that were in the wrong place. I can just very easily go back and remove it or lighten it or touch it up. I'm loaded the toe of my 1/4 inch awesome angle with plantation pine, very, very thin. And I'm keeping the toe in the center of the flower, and I'm kind of floating it with a zigzag float up each petal. And I do spin it around and do each petal individually. It just really makes it much easier to hone in on that center area and allows each of those petals to start to evolve and separate. And I was so amazed at what a big difference this little bit of paint makes. Just a hint of color, and those flowers are really starting to take shape. Going back with a little bit of celery shoot just to brighten up. I'm using my 1/4 inch. Everything else that I have done up to this point is with the 1/2 inch, but with the 1/4 inch I have a little more control, and I can add in those highlights with a little more intent, and the placement is going to be more defined. The first application of white for the petals was very thin. They look a little bit weak, so I'm going back with Snow White, using my 1/2 or 1/4 inch angle to brighten those tips up and pulling it down into the petals. And you can see how it starts to lift out. White, when it dries, becomes much duller, and so many applications of white is often needed to really brighten up and help that to be a stronger color. And I just think it's almost kind of magical to watch the flowers evolve with the very simple strokes and just a minimal amount of paint that I've used so far. I think overall this project took about an hour and a half, and I was really pleased with how quickly it came together, and the overall finished look I was very pleased with. I think you're really going to like this technique. It's just hard as decorative painters, we're used to really base coating heavy and shading heavy and highlighting very heavily. It's hard to kind of pull back and use just a little float of paint. I would say this is more like watercolor than acrylic painting, but we do have the benefits of acrylic painting and the opacity that it does offer. Should we want to go a little bit heavier, it's much easier to achieve with acrylic paints. If you've ever watercolored, it's just sometimes a challenge to get those stronger coverages in. If you like the video, be sure to comment and hit the bell. Love to hear from you. So if there's something else that you would like me to paint, or a technique that would be fun to explore together, write it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you subscribe to my channel, you won't miss out on future videos. I have quite a few lined up. I am going back with a little bit of plantation pine, and again, it's just a little bit of plantation pine. I'm floating it along the bottom of the lemons just to give a hint of green, a hint of color. And when I say a hint, it's just a little bit of color makes a big difference. So this does not have to be a heavy float. And I don't even think on camera it shows up that much, but believe me, it does make a huge difference on that lemon to have that bit of color on there. I'm using my number 3 Spectacular stencil brush to dry brush white on the highlights of the lemons, and make sure to wipe the brush off. Paint was too heavy, and I thought I could add the highlight without wiping the brush off, and I kind of overdid it there. So I went back and lifted it up, but just a light dry brush of Snow White. The stencil brushes are perfect for adding dry brushing and highlights. Just using the toe of my 1/8 inch awesome angle to float in the very center of the flowers, to really deepen that center area. Also going with a little bit of shading around the petals to help divide them and layer them, add that shadowing. This is the shadow color. This is the continuity color that kind of pulls everything together. Now I'm just dip dotting baby duck in the center of the flowers, just a few random dots, dip dots, maybe 4 or 5. I think I always kind of stick with odd numbers. I didn't even count. I just kind of filled it up. Just bounce it around so they're not, the dots are random in placement, also random in size. That really adds a lot more interest. This is raw umber. I wanted to make sure everything is connected with stems. The first stems that I put in were just kind of loose and just for placement. Going back with my Epic script liner and Snow White just to touch up the tips of any of the flower petals that need it. My lemon was a little bit odd shaped, so I went back to shape that up. I really wanted to enhance that flat top part on the lemons using baby duck to highlight that. Pull it across. Make sure that it's shaped correctly. And you just have to kind of look at it. Even if you have a pattern, after you paint it on, sometimes the shapes get a little bit off. So it's just really easier to go back and touch them up. I need to add a little fine line of white around the chipped edging. I'm using a white Uniball pen. I just really have found this is a perfect pen for doing this. It will not, it flows out nice and even, but if you go too fast, it'll start to skip. So slow down, allow time for the ink to come down the barrel and onto the surface. A white script liner and Snow White paint may be used. I have found out the Uniball pen is just awesome. Goes quickly and it really covers well. Just going back with a hint, and just a little bit of paint makes a big difference. This is raw umber. Just going in and looking at these petals, and you can see how I can just really quickly and easily divide them and shade them and straighten them up. Because I've used all of these same colors in the background, it just works so well. I just think that looks so amazing. And you know how much time it took. It goes very, very quickly. And just little touches of paint right in that little edge there where it looks empty. I can add those in. While I'm in there, I can enhance the shading if I need to. This flower I'm going to talk about a little more later. I kind of put a real sharp line to help to divide this out, and I'll show you how I fix that later on. Making sure I wanted to enhance, or I wanted to darken the bottom edge of the lemons, any shading, overlap areas. I'm using raw umber. Always make sure that's super thin. I didn't want to cover up that beautiful green float that I added. So if the paint is super thin, it makes it really easy to add that darkness without covering up prior layers. Because the paint is so thin and loose, I can lay it in there, I can move it around, I can lift it out, I can really manipulate it so that it goes where I want it to. If it needs to be removed, it's very thin and lightweight, so it can be removed very easily as well. Just reinforcing some of the shading with raw umber and fixing any areas, the back shadows that need to be made a little bit stronger. I thought this lemon was a little bit too thin. Super easy just to go back in and add those layers of color, and it blends in perfectly. This is where I fuss. I just pick up a little bit of paint, sharpen up the edges, fine-tune little details. Haven't done much of any small details during the whole design, but now I can add these little tiny touches that are really going to make it look like I have spent a lot of time creating the whole entire design. It's always those little touches that make such a big difference. I tried different colors to highlight the stems and the little branches, ended up with celery shoot. Yellow was matched the lemons, white was too strong. This is where I overemphasized the divide between the petals, and it just looked like it was outlined. Simply going back with thin Snow White and lightly glazing over that. With this type of painting, it's so easy to touch it up. Position the stencil, and I used my T ruler to make sure that it was exactly straight. I loaded my stencil brush with soft or lamp black, wiped it on a paper towel, and then just gently dry brushed using a circular motion. Let it dry. Now I'm going in with my number 5 Radical Round and thinned raw umber, just doing a drop shadow. This is very transparent, very thin paint. It's to the right and below each letter. It's just going to give that look of the letters being lifted off instead of painted on the background. That little bit makes such a big difference. Once that is drop shadow has been applied, I'm just repositioning the stencil, loading my spectacular stencil brush with lamp black. Always, always, always wipe it over a paper towel to get rid of excess paint. That prevents it from running under the stencil. This time, instead of swirling it, I'm just gently tapping up and down. It's going to provide a more opaque coverage because I put that first coat on. The second coat's going to cover really well. Plus, lamp black is a very strong color. Because I used the white Uniball pen, I did spray seal it with a matte varnish. And then after that dried, I applied a couple coats of ultra matte varnish over top of that. And that's just to protect it. I love how it turned out. I hope you learned a few new tips, tricks, and techniques to make this project a little bit easier. Everything I used is listed in the links below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss out on future videos. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. Remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.